He's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 29 years of experience.
And he's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Well, Howard, we're back with a new episode. And today I thought we'd broach a topic that amazingly we have not talked about in how many years we've been
Four and
doing
a half,
this.
four and a half years. You'd think
And
this had been our first topic, but no, we didn't get there.
and it is the history of the creative brief, and where does the brief come from, and since when does the creative brief exist. And it's interesting how I got into thinking about this topic. Was I was looking at Stephen King's famous account planning guide. It's a, I don't know, 30 something page PDF. It's been around. It's like every strategist has it or should have it somewhere on their computer. And we're looking for podcast topics, among other things. And I said, well, I don't remember. What does Stephen King say about brief? So I went into the document, and to my surprise, the word brief is not mentioned once in the document. And I thought, well, that's interesting that this document that's kind of the Bible for account planning, now we call it strategy, um, doesn't mention the brief. So I started like digging into like, when does the creative brief like really um, come into consciousness in our industry. And like everything, it's not a necessarily linear story. It's kind of, a convergence of several things. And there have been several things that have been called briefs over the years. So in the very beginning, a brief, um, I'm reliably told, was like a memo that was basically a bare bones, like, these are the details of the assignment. What do we have to deliver? What's the deadline? It's like a job ticket.
Wait a minute, Henry. Are you sure that was actually written down? My understanding is that it was a detailed collaborative conversation between folks like you and folks like me.
Yes. Now you're talking about what we currently think of as a brief. I'm telling you what was called a brief back then, but was nothing like what we have
Okay.
as a brief today. So there was a document called a brief that had nothing to do with what we think of as a brief today. It was just basically a job ticket.
And
Um,
let me just interrupt you and say, ladies and gentlemen out in our audience, all 17 of you, if you've got something in your archives, and there are a couple of you like Dave Dye who might have them, boy, would we love to see them. So, send us something.
but then the account planning is born, right? So this kind of job ticket type of brief was something that existed before account planning. Account planning is born in the late 60s and the early 70s. We know in the UK, mainly with Stephen King at J. Walter Thompson and Stanley Pollitt at BMP. And they start really honing in on how advertising works, how consumer thinking works, and understanding consumers, and how to do good research to create better, more effective advertising. Um, and it was at this stage where there was kind of this strategy, but there wasn't a brief. And I think that this is where what you were referring to is the planners would have a briefing with creatives that was a discussion. Basically, it wasn't a form, there was no template. It was basically, this is what we know about the consumer in this particular case, this is what we know about the competition, and the topics overlapped with a lot of what would currently exist on a brief, but it wasn't a document. And then it was probably in the 80s that we start seeing um, real creative briefs as a document, something memorialized, a kind of a contract of, this is what we should be doing strategically in an assignment start to take hold. And I the credit is given a lot, and I have no reason to not give that credit to Shia Day and Jane Newman, who was the head of planning at Shia Day, who really brought planning to the United States and popularized it. And I think that the American um, way of working and thinking was kind of what dictated that idea of having a form or a format. And I think that probably, in my mind at least, part of it was also agencies looking for unique black box ways of doing business that they could sell to clients, right? Like
Well,
we have a patented creative work plan slash brief that is different than everybody else's, and that's what helps us to get you better advertise. So I think the necessity is the mother of invention, and so there was this need to codify the strategist thinking into a brief, but also the need for the agency to be able to market itself as doing something unique from other agents.
so this is John Steele's unique contribution to the evolution or the emergence, I think, of the definitely planning, but because he wrote about creative briefs in his wonderful book, Truth Lies in Advertising, as I think he was the first planner hired by Goodby Silverstein and Partners, and his unique contribution fits that, I think, appropriate description that you just described as the black box. Every agency wanted to have its own unique way of going about promoting its best practices to its clients. And then, of course, the other thing that I recall, because, and I've talked to you about this many, many times, I have at least an excerpt of a brief written in the early to mid 1980s by Leo Burnett in Chicago for NyQuil. I wish I had the entire brief, but this excerpt, which is a description of the customer, who are we talking to, is a brilliant word picture of what happens to someone who gets a cold. It's not the typical bullet points of household income and age and demographics. It's just because everybody gets a cold. So there's an early example of, I think we would both agree, a brilliant, inspiring excerpt from a whole brief. Boy, I wish I could get my hands on the whole thing.
So, and as we're talking, I'm thinking probably another reason why the creative brief comes into existence as a document, and why it comes into existence in the way that we're familiar with it as a series of questions, is if account planning didn't exist at a certain point and then it starts to exist, so you have people that are coming into planning that need to be trained and need to
Right.
understand. So having that template, that document, is a how-to. I mean, it's literally asking you the questions that you need to answer in order to get this thing done, in order to do a good creative briefing. And so it only makes sense that it eventually would be codified. So I
And
think you meant.
I could be completely wrong, but because of John Steele's book, he may be one of the pioneers of talking about and introducing this document and then writing about it and explaining and giving his expertise on how to make it a good document. So his book came about, I think,
In the 90s.
in the
It
90s.
looks like in the 90s, yeah.
Yeah, 97. So that kind of makes sense. A good decade under his belt, launching and running one of the premier planning departments in the United States and in a US agency. Now he's looking back and saying, okay, what have we learned about planning and how does the brief fit into that? I'm sure there are others who are writing about the brief, but John Steele, I think, was one of the giants who was writing about it.
So I think you mentioned Leo Burnett
Yeah,
as the agency that brief that you like to use
for
came
NyQuil.
from. So Leo Burnett had one of the earliest kind of recognized uh, creative brief templates that they called a creative work plan.
Mm.
And uh, not so originally, Young and Rubicam's template, which was a little different, was also called a creative work plan. Um, and I was exposed to that one pretty early in my career. I had a boss, the head of the Miami office of Bromley Advertising at the time, and she had come up through Young and Rubicam, and so I was a self-taught strategist, basically making it up as I went along. And she gave me four documents that uh, Y&R used, and one of them was that creative work plan. There was another one that was for the brand. So once you did the one for the brand, then you could do the one for like the advertising execution or campaign. Um, so I thought that was interesting. And then of course we see this proliferation of types of briefs, brief templates, you know, this competition to create something new via a template. Um, and I think that we've beaten this horse to death, but it's worth repeating that pretty much all of these templates have common ingredients to them. And if it's missing one of those common ingredients, right? Like if it doesn't talk about the target audience and what their needs and desires are, it's probably not a good brief template. If it doesn't if it doesn't give you something interesting about the brand and how it might solve whatever tension the consumer has, it's probably not going to be a good brief. If it doesn't have some sort of summary, or single thing that creators should latch on to, a single-minded proposition or one thing we must communicate, it's probably not a great um, template. But like everything, the answers are what make the quality of the brief, not the template itself or the questions that are asked.
But Henry, it really bears repeating over and over again because to this day, 20 years after I began my career as a creative brief writing trainer, I still get the question, do we need to examine our creative brief template? I get it all the time. Now, it's mostly for marketers, but I'm just going to make the assumption that there are more than a few strategists at agencies who think the same thing. If we could just have a better template, maybe we'd get better answers. Well, I like the second part of that. We get better answers, but the template isn't going to prompt better answers. It's what you and I have been talking about for the last 4 years. It's better thinking, right?
Yeah, it's the
Clear
quality
thinking.
the quality of the thinking of the person who's answering the questions.
Right.
Uh,
But that's what makes this topic that this topic today so fascinating and so kind of mind-boggling. It's like we've just sort of assumed that this document emerged when it was supposed to emerge, but we never stopped to say, well, okay, when was that? And what was it? And what was its role? How did it actually function in the agency world? I think a harder question, and we don't know if we can answer this, is when did it migrate onto the client side? I mean, they've been doing something. You and I both know that information that is helpful for a brief has been delivered to an agency from the client and everything from the back of a napkin to a 30-page Marcom brief, which is like a treasure hunt. Like, can you
and
find X that marks the spot? You know?
Probably for decades it was via telephone conversation.
Yeah.
So to me the most enlightening part of like doing some of this, looking into the history of the brief, was a reminder that really it's the briefing that is supreme, right? And if you think about it, it makes sense. So a guy like Stephen King didn't walk in with a paper in his hand. He walked into a room to have a discussion and he covered off certain topics. Now I think the lesson for us is we can walk in with a paper in our hand, but that paper is only to remind us of the important topics that we need to have conversation about during that briefing.
I have heard it said, and I forget who said it, and shame on me because this is a brilliant conclusion. But I heard it said on a podcast I think Mark Pollard was hosting the podcast, and I forget the name of his guest, but it inspired me when I put together my workshop on how to take this document that you've written and spent so much time polishing, and then you take it and you use it to brief. And this guest said the briefing itself should be standing room only. Everybody in the agency should have this high expectation of a show that's being put on by the presenters, whether it's one person or five, that briefs the creatives. And again, it's not delivering the brief for the first time. The creatives need to have known the brief and elements of the brief in advance of the briefing so that they're set to ask and to have ask different kinds of questions and have a different kind of conversation with a document that they're already familiar with. But the fact that this is supposed to be or should be elevated to standing room only, meaning everybody in the agency should drop what they're doing and show up for that briefing, speaks highly of the expectations that should be paramount for that kind of a situation. But do we treat it that way?
No,
I don't
I
think
don't
so.
think I don't think it's treated that way. But again, for me, it helps. This discussion helps put the brief in proper context. It's a discussion guide for the briefing.
Yes.
It's not an end unto itself.
No, and I would amplify that by saying, because this is another question that I get a lot when I'm doing my training, and then I've made it a point of not waiting for the question or bringing it up. Not every project requires a brief. And I've encountered so many marketers who write a brief when they have to change the font. It's like, are you crazy? That's just a work order.
Yeah.
So if you don't need to write a brief for every project that you do, you draw the line in the sand. You say this X, 10%, 30%, whatever it is of projects that you are sending through your system, those are the ones that require the brief. The rest can be just something else, work order, project order. Okay, so you've identified those top X number of projects that require a brief. Those are the projects where the briefing itself should be the party, should be the show-stopping event that everybody wants to attend, which makes it more possible because otherwise you're trying to treat every briefing the same way, and that's never going to allow you to bring that kind of energy.
The related but not exactly the same topic is year to year when you have brand campaigns. You know, I think there's this feeling that you need a new brief, and the truth is, a lot of times,
You
not
don't.
that much has changed in
No.
in a span of 12 months. And if a campaign was working that was built on a particular brief, and you need to refresh, well, then let's go back to that brief and use it again.
Well,
I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
do you know how much pushback I've received when I do a talk? Not even a training, but I do a talk on that, and the question comes, how often should you change the brief? And I used your exact words. And I get this, are you kidding me? Look, why would
Yeah.
you not want to write? Well, the argument that I think helps support this is that think about all the work that didn't get presented from that first brief. Now, that doesn't guarantee that you want to bring any of that rejected work back to the table, but it's proof that you put one team, two teams, three teams, they're going to develop 30, 40, 50 ideas each, only two or three of which are going to go to the client. So there's a lot of work from one brief.
Plus, the point of, if you wrote a really good brief, you dug deep into the research, you found the human insight, you found where the competition stands versus your brand, and you found something that you felt was the answer. Did that answer change in 12 months? Did the research change? Did consumer mindsets change? Did the
No.
competitive situation change that much in 12 months that um, the philosophical answer that you came up with for this brand now has to be a different philosophical answer? I doubt it highly. Like
I
that just
agree.
doesn't.
I agree. And then of course you give that same brief to the same creative teams. A
They're
year
gonna
later,
come up with new stuff.
exactly. We're going to come up with something different. We're going to see the world differently 12 months later. So to
Correct.
assume that we're just going to come up with the same stuff clearly indicates to me that you don't understand how creativity works in the first
Yeah.
place. But yeah, I like that. So what else did you find fascinating, Henry, in this your research about the history of this term, the brief, and how it's evolved?
Um, you know, not a ton more, but there was another. I mentioned at the beginning that there was a confluence of things that led to the development of a creative brief, and one of the things of course, mentioned Procter and Gamble
Mhm.
was one of the brands that was pioneer in not brand companies that was a pioneer in brand advertising, a company with many brands that uh, on the client side helped develop modern branding. And they had something that they called a copy brief, which had some elements of what we would consider a modern creative brief. So I think that influence, in addition to what was going on with the advertising agencies developing account planning, helped kind of arrive us at this current paradigm of a creative brief. And probably, as you mentioned, where clients themselves started developing briefs, right? Because they
Right.
were so to me, there's an interesting interplay there between, the very sophisticated companies that helped establish this practice of branding and advertising, and their contribution to how we see the world of the consumer, and particularly how we brief creatives for advertising and marketing assignments.
Well, actually, we have to confess, Henry, we deliberately delayed this topic until 4.5 years into our podcast because we wanted to tease everybody with it. We knew it was
Yeah,
an important topic, but we thought we'd wait. So it's good that we got to it now, right?
absolutely. Better late than never.
Exactly. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye bye.